Thank you. Thank you, Franz. Thank you, Rebecca. We will jump right in. Ambassador Franz Perrez is the head of the international division of the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment and the Ambassador for Environment. He has served as chief negotiator on all issues environmental, and it's really fantastic to have you here with us today, Franz. And Rebecca is a scientist turned diplomat and has represented the United States at the UN from 2006 to 2014, and was responsible for US negotiations of these issues that we call international environmental governance and the outcome document of the Rio +20 conference. So Franz and Rebecca have negotiated side by side. They have discussed what UNEP is, what UNEP should be, and it will be fantastic today to take a step back, celebrate the achievements, celebrate that 50th anniversary, and look forward and say, where can we go from here? So welcome, Franz, welcome, Rebecca. And before we start, I just want to say that a copy of this book will be sent to whoever from the audience is most active on Twitter. Meg Hassey is putting the message on in the chat with various handles. And so if you hear issues today that excite you, please tweet, please talk about this, open the dialogue. And the ones, we have a book copy to send to whoever is active engaging on Twitter today with these issues. So Franz, welcome, and thank you for battling the difficulties. Rebecca, welcome. Franz is joining us from Switzerland, Rebecca is joining us from Germany, and we welcome you here from Boston. So to start off, please tell us how you got to where you are and what is the key UNEP thread throughout your career that you still might be holding parts of. Franz, I'll turn over to you. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thanks a lot, Maria, and thanks a lot for organizing this series of events and for inviting me. And apologies again for the technical challenges. The link didn't work so I was choosing to use a cell phone, and it seems to work for the moment at least. Thanks a lot. Well, how did I become an ambassador for the environment? I think that is not something that you plan for, because there are not many positions like that. It's something like that you just grow into it through your career, professional career. But I think what was certainly critical for me to be able to get to that position was my very early interest in issues of the environment, in political questions, and then I was studying law. I was then working first for the Foreign Ministry in Switzerland in a Department of Public International Law, and then I think that was probably the first really critical step. I went then to NYU to make a master's degree in the US and the PhD. And that opened for me really the door to international law, to international environmental law, also trade law, negotiations. That were the things which I really learned there at NYU. Then coming back, I was first working for the Trade Ministry, doing trade and environment, WTO laws, and from there I moved to the Ministry for Environment into the International Affairs Division. In those times, this division was headed always by a career diplomat. I purposely did choose not I did not choose the path of a career diplomat, although I was working for a ministry for several reasons. And then here in the Ministry for the Environment, in the International Affairs Division, when this position opened, it was for the first time that it was opened also for non-career diplomats, and then I was applying for it and I got it. So that is just the CV, but I think that does not explain why I'm here. I think you asked what is a threat, what makes it interesting and also possible to fulfill such a position. I think that is the interest, first of all, in international negotiations, in that act of creativity, of searching solutions for problems you care for. I think that if you don't have that interest in the substance, interest in the political questions, and the interest in finding solutions that serve all the different interests involved, then this will not. Then you would not be happy in such a position as a lead negotiator. And I always believe in order to be good, in order to be successful, in order to be pleased in your work, you need to be happy about what you're doing. And I think that is probably the critical thread throughout my life. I was happy about what I'm doing and still am.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, Franz. It's so wonderful to see you again. And
I'm here.
I think, and that was absolutely perfect. Problem solving. And you know what Maria and I spoke about this at the beginning. What I'm doing now is teaching negotiations, and I often like to tell people that it's problem solving with friends, because in my experience, the best negotiations have felt that way, right? You're sitting around the table with a bunch of people that, well, you hopefully know them, optimally respect them, right? And you're trying to solve really important problems. So how did I get here? The short version is interest, opportunity, and being mindful of my own priorities. Maria said I started as a scientist, and in that role, I became very interested in environmental affairs and also international relations. How do we collaborate, you know, as countries and as individuals across the globe, which led me to a fellowship at the State Department in the UN Bureau, where I learned all about the importance of collaboration in that multilateral sphere, that very, very important place where we can all have a voice as global actors. And when the environment portfolio, which I was already interested in, opened up, I jumped at the opportunity. And as I already said again to Maria at the very beginning, I learned so much through that experience, so much about problem solving with friends from my counterparts, from my own delegation, that with two former counterparts and friends, we wrote a book about negotiations together. And that's what we teach now. Because we do believe together that it's important to give people the tools to effectively make a difference in the world. And we agree that it's about problem solving with friends.
Problem solving with friends. This is a very different description of the international environmental governance.
We don't always feel like friends, do we? No, but one of the things we argue is we should try to get closer to that, right? We all have the same interests ultimately.
And that's a really important point. We all have the same interests. Supposedly, we have the same interest. We are working toward the same goals. And the two of you have been working with UNEP at UNEP, trying to move that discussion. I started mentioning the international environmental governance reform, and both of you were key players in those reform discussions. So I'd like you, since we are celebrating UNEP at 50 here, I'd like you to take a step back, look at your career trajectory. What was it? What happened during that international environmental governance reform discussion? And what did you discover were UNEP's strengths? What were its weaknesses? And what did you manage to change? Franz.
Should I read first? Okay, thanks. Well, I think you have indicated, and that's something that what I've learned from you, Maria, is that we had several waves of reforms and efforts to strengthen UNEP. But throughout these efforts, it was clear what you have always underlined, the initial mandate that UNEP had was a good mandate. So UNEP, it was never a problem of the mandate, it was a problem, what did we do with that mandate? And what are the institutional possibilities that UNEP has in order to deliver on that mandate? And before coming back to the steps of strengthening UNEP through these different waves of efforts of strengthening UNEP, I think what is the core added value of UNEP? I think there are two things. The first, UNEP creates a space, a forum that brings together the states of this world in order to solve problems. So creating a space, that's already a huge comparative advantage and added value. And the second added value, it's not creating any space, it's creating a space that is focusing on the environmental issue. It's not diluting environmental concerns with and counterbalancing with others. The focus is environment, the environmental pillar of sustainable development. And it is supporting that space and that focus by also providing information, collecting information, providing newest up-to-date knowledge that is needed to formulate policies. I think these are the three strengths, to be a space with the authority, the credibility, and the competence, and the focus on the environment. And the mandate that when UNEP was established was a good mandate, but it was not used sufficiently. And then we were realizing throughout our work with UNEP, there are certain limitations to UNEP. One was clearly that UNEP, when it was established organization-wide, it did not have universal membership. And that was a problem of the authority of UNEP, because it was often argued, well, if the UNEP Governing Council, the body that did not have universal membership, was deciding something, this Governing Council, because it did not have universal membership, didn't have the authority, the moral and political authority to provide overarching guidance over the whole political system. And I think that was one of the key successes then of the Rio+20 conference, to provide universal membership to the governing body of UNEP. So I think that was one of the elements that we were able, through negotiating between friends or between colleagues, and at least between colleagues from all around the world, who were motivated to strengthen that space, to find common problems, to solve common problems. And I think that was one of the key successes in that process. I would say there were also other efforts undertaken which were perhaps not as obviously successful. One, I think it's obvious that the financial situation of UNEP is not ideal. Compared with other institutions, UNEP does not have a comparable financial support compared with other institutions. We were also able in Rio+10 in 2002 in Johannesburg, we were able in the lead up there to agree in the Cartagena process on a new model to try to increase financial contribution by UNEP by establishing that indicative scale of voluntary contribution that tried to motivate all parties to provide a fair share to the budget of UNEP. And that was successful. It was not as successful as you might have hoped, but it has increased the contribution, the financial contribution to UNEP. And there's still much work to be done on that area. Another area, perhaps, where we are not sufficiently successful is that UNEP, it tried a lot of political simulation, a lot of political guidance. It's triggered a lot of also very important work like mandates for negotiating new conventions. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But where UNEP probably was not as strong as it could have been, that is by establishing something like the Millennium Development Goals, to establish a core set of goals that unifies all of us with regard to the environment. What goals do we have to achieve in order that unifies all our efforts, where we could work together in the same direction? There, I think there's a space where UNEP still could improve.
Thank you, Franz. Thank you. This is a really great start of pulling a lot of these threads together. So, Rebecca, from your point, what is that comparative advantage? What have you seen?
So I think, and Franz made a lot of really good points there. And in your book, you do as well. You make quite clearly the point that that UNEP is unique, and its mandate from the beginning was strong, right? And I agree that it had and has the right mandate, and there remains promise in its comparative advantage from that perspective. But my role on the delegation is interesting. You talk in your book about John W. McDonald, who was really active for the US in the original Rio conference, right? And he Stockholm, not Rio, right? In the Stockholm conference in 1972, the one that created UNEP.
Exactly.
Right. So he came from my old office at the State Department, IOESA. So that's the office that I operated from. And so my perspective on the system was, my role was to care for, if you will, the US relationship with all of these actors on the environment, because we had specialists and experts working with each individual one. And one of my jobs was to sort of try to look at the whole system and put it in the context of the broader UN system, right? So that was my lens on all of this sort of IEG conversation and UNEP strength and weakness discussion. And so I was often frustrated during some of the IEG discussions. And ultimately, I actually, Franz, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think paragraph 88 in the Rio+20 outcome is really, really important. I think we did a lot of great things there, and I'm immensely proud of it. I think you're right about the authority of UNEP, and we really helped to bolster it there. I think we created some additional difficulties as well, as one always does with the best of intentions, right? However, I think the biggest problem remains is that UNEP has been limited because of member states, right? And as a former US official, I can say this now, I really believe that UNEP has been limited because of member states. And as member states, we did not give it the tools or give it the tools consistently over time, right? There were various actors at its creation, some of whom were more for than, others more against. And there was never kind of a clear feeling about it that was consistent over time. And that speaks to why the budget has gone up and down and why it's maybe not as big as you might like. I think also the issue is who's representing countries at UNEP and at other decision-making bodies like New York. What is there consistency across the UN system? And what I saw from my role is that there isn't, right? So just using the example of my own country, and this is, we're not the worst for sure in this, but we send a delegation to a UNEP meeting and we have priorities and we say certain things, but we maybe aren't as coordinated with the delegation to the, I don't know, let's use another example of UNCTAD meeting. And there we're undermining, UNCTAD doesn't really undermine UNEP, but just to use an example, we're undermining each other with the messages we're sending. And because there's so much going on in the UN system and we all have various actors representing our countries, it's really hard to maintain that consistency and to ensure we're bolstering our priorities in each forum in the other forums, right? Because the UN is a system and it has to work together. So governments have not consistently over the decades prioritized UNEP, nor have they considered who they're sending, how they're engaging, what they're messaging, and whether they are reinforcing their messages in the other venues. And I think that remains a key problem. And it will always be a challenge across the UN system, but I think it's especially hit UNEP hard, possibly because of the New York-Nairobi disconnect a little bit, which I saw a lot. I was active in both those venues. And so, for example, our delegation to UNDP needed to go to UNDP and say, hey, UNDP, UNEP has a coordinating role in environment, and you need to listen to them and take their money and implement, right? That needed to happen back in the 80s, right? And often, I worked closely with the person we sent to UNDP, and sometimes we did that and sometimes we didn't. And I'm sure other delegations were the same, right? And so this bureaucratic coordination and consistency over time and consistency in prioritization from member states has been a challenge, but I maintain that UNEP remains important. UNEP has a unique and important mandate. It has what it needs. We unfortunately just need to get member states to be there with it, right? And I think something, Franz, that you also said is really important, having that space. And I realize it's not, those of us who really support the environment, it's never going to be enough, but even just having maintained that space within UNEP, those relationships, that foundation of trust, those conversations, even just maintaining that is important because it is there for when we need it and are ready. And I really hope that that's soon.
So you, yes, please, yeah. Franz, come back. Yeah.
And we're doing great stuff. And we're doing great stuff. I mean, look at what just got agreed, right? You guys did amazing work there.
I think it's really very nice how you put it. I could underline every word. And you were making one comment which I would like just to follow up on. When you were saying, yes, paragraph 8, it's really great. I think it is great. And of course, it includes also some elements. For me, and it would be interesting to hear how you perceive that. Before UNEP Governing Council had universal membership, we had yearly meetings. And now, since it has universal membership, the rhythm was changed into biennial meetings.
I've been curious as to how that works, right? Because we negotiated that and we did that. And then I unfortunately left my role. So I've been curious to know how does that work? How does it work?
Because we were concerned about that decision.
Yeah.
And I have the impression because you said we tried to do our best, but we lost something. Because my impression was having these annual meetings. First of all, there were two different kind of meetings. One was a meeting in Nairobi with all the budget work, program of work, and all the very important role, building on the very important work of the community of permanent representatives in Nairobi. That was very important every 2 years, and that's sufficient. But in between, we had a meeting that was not taking place in Nairobi, but somewhere else in the world, which help to build up ownership also in that region, that country for the political issues. And that annual rhythm, from my perspective, allowed also to advance further on substance. For budget program of work, you don't need to have every year a meeting, but to progress on the substantive issue, it's important to bring the different capitals and ministers together every year to be able to advance and to build on what they have done last year. 2 years is just a lot of time in between. Of course, you can have intersessional work and all that, but at the end, it is that meeting of UNEP, of the Governing Council, of the ministers of the environment, who make the political decision to advance the agenda.
And this remains the issue because not every country has a mission in Nairobi, right? So you cannot
Absolutely,
have all those voices together.
Absolutely right. Good point. Yes.
Right, because I agree with you. It is important to maintain those relationships, but it was also a hard pace of meetings occasionally, right? And sometimes it felt like nothing was happening. But I agree with you that the maintenance of the relationship is an important consideration in all of this stuff. Absolutely, in all of this stuff, in all of these dynamics.
So as you see, the negotiators have started the back and forth right away, jumping in the questions. And you've underlined some really important threads here. And that is UNEP's mandate for coordination, which I say in the book is the one thing that UNEP has actually failed at. The reasons Rebecca alluded to, the complexity of the UN system, the inability of governments to support this, the unwillingness of anyone to be coordinated. And so it has transitioned into much more of a coherence challenge. But so that coordination, coherence, and the consistency, right? How do you ensure the consistency at the government level when governments change? So, and when people leave their positions. So Rebecca is an example of a negotiator who has left. Franz is an example of a negotiator who has been there for quite a while and has seen that red thread through. So how do you ensure that consistent? What could we do to ensure that consistency?
That's the perennial challenge. That's right. Bureaucracies, right? This is the ever-present problem within any bureaucracy. It just is. As a firm believer in the UN, at a certain level, it just takes governments really getting on board with multilateralism. And that's a hard thing for some governments to do. And so, because nobody likes to be coordinated. Sometimes that was my role, right? As the sort of UN person on any of these environment delegations, my role was to try to maintain coordination. And I had great colleagues to work with on that. I was really lucky, but it was still a hard job to do just within the environment realm, let alone the rest of the UN system that I was always also trying to pull in. So, I mean, it takes political priority at the highest level, and politicians change.
Yeah.
And there's inconsistent support for both environment and multilateralism at the political level.
Franz,
I don't have an easy solution.
Franz, you wanted to say
come up with some options.
I think you touched upon very good points, Rebecca, once again. I think there are different levels of coordination. One is, of course, let's not say within a country. You referred to that also previously, to coordination which goes beyond our work from each UNEP governing council to the next, but also the whole UN system. There, I think this is a challenge for all of us, coordination, that we have convey the same message in UNEP, in UNDP, and WIPO, and wherever. Then my impression is the smaller administration, sometimes we are suffering from being small delegations and small administration, but sometimes there's also advantage about that. It's easier to coordinate the smaller entity than the bigger one. But that's a challenge for each country. And we should not see that as bad will or bad intent if countries are not perfectly coordinated. None of it is perfectly. But we have to acknowledge that. That is a challenge, and we have to also understand our partners if there are such problems and react with understanding and trying to help. But the national level, that is. Then you referred also to ministers change. Of course they change. And I think that is democracies. If ministers never change, that's not. And that is, of course, if a new minister, if a new government has new priorities, I think. But one element to provide certain consistency over time is at the end establishing binding frameworks, and not only voluntary frameworks. In a voluntary framework, it's much easier to change the national policies than in a framework where you are bound in with certain obligations. Of course, you can leave a convention, but it's always more difficult to leave a convention. And many of the conventions, change of ministers, the conventions remain, and countries do not leave them. There might be just a few of them. So I think trying a framework at the international level that is as stable as possible, as binding as possible, that can help coherence over time. But then there's a third element of coordination. And there perhaps I do not fully agree with your assessment, Maria, that UNEP has only failed. That is institutional coherence and coordination. I think there, UNEP, of course, the whole UN system, it's complex, multi-layered, and many institutions. But UNEP, for example, in the area what they did with regard to the Chemicals and Waste Convention, UNEP together with the conventions, by providing a more coherent system, by bringing institutions closer together, I think that was an amazing work done by UNEP, by the UNEP secretariats and conventions of the Basel Convention, Rotterdam, the Stockholm Convention. 3 legally totally independent conventions were able to merge their secretariat with the support of UNEP. They organize their meetings now together. These are 3 independent, separate conferences of the parties. But by having these meetings together, that makes it much easier to take coherent positions. You do not always need to merge secretariats and COPs. You can also promote coherence through other means, like we are now doing the biodiversity cluster. And again, where UNEP is also playing a very critical role by providing an overarching framework, as you had in chemicals with the cycle, the strategic approach on international chemicals management, or on biodiversity with Aichi targets, and now the new global biodiversity framework, where a set of goals for the whole biodiversity cluster are negotiated. And there again, I think UNEP played also a very supportive role to provide, for a political orientation perspective, more coherence in a system. Because we always need to find the fine balance, the right balance between specificity of certain processes and coherence with everything. We cannot do everything at the same place. So there's a benefit of having specialized different entities, but it's also important to make sure that they work closely together. So it is a different situation, but there are at least 2 areas, I think, where UNEP did do things that perhaps 20 years ago nobody would have thought possible. To merge the COPs, to merge the secretariat of 3 different conventions, or to establish an overarching framework with objectives for a whole cluster where different conventions contribute to different institutions. So there are also some successes, and we have should perhaps try to learn more or build more on these successes and apply them also to other areas, water, forest, whatever.
We'll talk about the conventions in a bit, because they're really important, and talk about multitude of different bodies in different locations with different membership. And the coherence challenge there is much higher. On this point, there's this other coherence. One is the coherence we're talking about across these institutions at the UN level, but then there's the other one, as you all already pointed out, at the national level. At the national level, one among the different institutions at the national, or the same institution in different fora, but then there's the multiple different institutions at the national level. And I see in the Q&A box a question from Judge Zafar Gondal, and he's saying that UNEP is providing the space and a platform for discussion, but he says, how do we make sure that this is implemented at the national level and at the subnational level, the rule of law? What steps is UNEP envisioned to take in this decade of action? And you can see his input in the chat. But what is the role of UNEP for greater coherence of action and improvement of implementation at the national level? This takes us back to the key debates in that discussion on international environmental governance that you were both so engaged in. Is UNEP normative, or is it operational? Does it set the goals, the policies, or does it actually work on the ground on implementation? So what are your thoughts on that? Rebecca.
So I think I go back to the original mandate of UNEP, right, which I think was quite, your book reminded me of how sort of visionary that was. Environment was becoming a complex issue. There was not absolutely consensus across the globe on how it should be treated. It remains that way, right? There's the divide of developed, developing. There's the divide, as you just referred to, of local, international, right? And how do you bridge these? And so I love the original vision, which was that UNEP is meant to be an authoritative coordinator and have money that implements throughout the UN system, right? So it's normative. It's where governments come together to convene, to agree on what the priorities are, to agree on what needs to happen. And then the pot of environment money is implemented by UNEP through the system. And then one can argue about how much implementation UNEP does itself. I think that was immensely clever. And I think, as you have told in your book, through a variety of different reasons and subsequent decisions that didn't work out precisely as envisioned. So I struggle with that. You also make this point in your book. We've gone too far along the implementation route for UNEP to pull back completely, I think. And I fear that's a little bit of a shame, because I think UNEP will never then get to its authoritative coordination role if it's implementing. And then it's trying to be still too much to too many. And I don't know how we thread that needle.
Franz, you were the president of the Basel Convention, the COP11 in 2013, in the Rotterdam Convention. You noted this coherence in the chemical sphere. How do we think about this implementation role versus coordination versus normative role, especially in regard with the conventions? And you've been very active with those.
Before coming back to the convention, let me just address that more horizontally. I clearly believe that UNEP has a normative role, along the lines also that Rebecca was saying. That was an important, critical mandate, and we should not weaken that normative mandate, because by adding additional elements to the institution that was built purposely for a certain purpose, by adding additional tasks, you do not necessarily help that institutions. So it is with its scientific task, with its normative task, and with its catalytic task to make the other machinery, the UN machinery is more than UNEP. We have the machineries that are in place to support implementation. Also at the national level, international cooperation, that's not done by the foreign ministry in our case. We have a specialized entity who is doing international cooperation, providing support to implement it at the international level. So UNEP clearly has that. But that's also important. That political role is also important for the implementation, because first, I think we have to say implementation has to happen at the national level, and nations have to implement. If we think that someone else could come in and solve for us the problem, that will not be sustainable. So countries need to do it themselves, and they will be enabled and empowered and have the capacity to do so. But what is first important, you need to understand the problem. And many countries even don't have the capacity to understand a certain problem. Also, countries like Switzerland, individual countries individually cannot fully understand perhaps a problem that is too complex or too global. So having that space to look together at the problem from all different angles from the world helps already to understand the problem. That's a first step to implementation.
More perspectives help in understanding. Always, exactly. Right? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I fully agree. The second step is then also to identify solutions. And that's also something, because you cannot implement if you do not know what could be a possible solution. And again, UNEP can be a very important role just by making these possible solutions understandable and making them known. And then thirdly, also by providing visibility both to the problem and the possible solutions, and perhaps providing some guidance how these solutions could be implemented. That is, from each country, tremendously helpful. Be you a developing country or a developed country, we all benefit, because that is a pooling of capacity, a pooling of knowledge, a pooling of perspectives, as you were just saying, Rebecca, and that adds to the quality and the robustness of the guidance. So we all benefit from that. And it makes it then easier to implement something at home if you know that your partner is having similar problems and is undertaking the same problem. And then another role, I think, where UNEP also can play a very important role, that brings us back then to the role within the UN families to catalyze the whole UNEP system to support the implementation of that. UNEP doesn't have to do it itself. You have UNDP, you have many institutions in the UN, and that's what Rebecca was referring to. it is important then that once we develop solutions within that specialized agency, UNEP, then we have to make sure that the other parts of the UN system follow and support also the implementations in countries that need such support. But at the end, if the country is not motivated itself, if the ministry, the minister, the population is not motivated to solve the problem and to address it, then all support cannot help. And therefore, I think UNEP is very critical for implementation. And now to your question, relation to MEA, I think that is something where UNEP can also play a tremendously supportive role to MEAs, not only by providing a secretariat, and through that also providing a certain coherence between the work in the different secretariats. That's very important. We should not underestimate that. But also by giving more visibility than a secretariat alone can provide to a certain topic, and also by providing its support to catalyze actions by others. For a smaller convention secretariat, it might be more difficult to catalyze a UNDP, the chef, or whoever it is, to do action, to catalyze the whole UN system. But with a mother institution, UNEP, that is something that is really strengthening that visibility, and also that push to the whole UN system to support the implementation of each of the individual conventions.
All right, Franz, you talk about visibility and how important that is. I'd like to throw out just to think about it. How do we ensure visibility? What does UNEP need to enhance visibility of the different conventions, of the issues, of the countries? Put that to the side, but you also talk about UNDP, and that's a very important relationship, UNEP and UNDP. We now have the former executive director of UNEP as the administrator of UNDP, Joachim Steiner, and indeed he was in the second installment of this very dialogue series in June of last year. And I see a question from Christine Durbach here about the relationship between UNDP and UNEP. She says it has expanded, the relationship with UNDP has expanded UNEP's role and has included areas now in UNDP that UNEP has specified, but is UNEP delimiting its role and trying to be exclusive and unique when it could be something more through a relationship with UNDP? And this was also from the very beginning. UNEP and UNDP were the first two agencies to create this collaborative. This was envisioned from before UNEP's creation. Where are we in that relationship right now, and what could be done better? Who'd like to take this on?
So say, Franz, this has to be for you because I've been out of the loop for a little bit.
This is a really difficult question, Maria. I would say that this is a really difficult question because there are always different layers of cooperation between institutions. First of all, I think UNEP should certainly not a close cooperation with UNDP and with other institutions in the UN system is certainly not weakening UNEP, but I think it's strengthening. Sometimes, I remember very well, that was after tsunamis where there was a struggle by the whole UN system to provide support by the countries that were hit by the tsunamis. And then UNEP was also asked, I can't remember which country it was, to build up the infrastructure again that was hit by the tsunami. And then there was a debate because if UNEP would have built up a village at the coast, that would have been very nice for a picture afterwards. And my minister, UNEP, we were building up a village again that was destroyed by tsunami, but that's not the task of UNEP. If UNEP was able to make sure that wherever UNDP and the whole UN machinery is building up villages again, nowhere asbestos will be used. That would have been a much bigger success, but that's less visible. So being very visible about the implementation at the end does not necessarily mean that you had a bigger impact. So sometimes UNEP can have a bigger impact by not trying to do it itself, but by cooperating with others and stimulating others to do it differently. And therefore, cooperating and working with others together to do it differently is not weakening UNEP at all. I'm convinced, even if you don't have a picture afterwards of the UNEP BD together with in front of your village in the media. I think you can achieve much more by cooperation. How is it now specifically with UNDP? My impression, well, personally, the two EDs certainly get very along with each other, which helps. My impression is that there's an interest on both sides to cooperate. I don't feel much of a competition or conflict, but perhaps I'm also too far away. I would have to ask my colleagues from the development cooperation how they perceive it. But in the last years, at least, I didn't perceive something. There was nothing on my radar where I would have said, "Oh, that is a huge problem. We need to give different guidance." But perhaps I'm not close enough to the problem.
That's indeed, the system has expanded, and it's hard to see all of its parts. And as we have talked with both of you, and in this setting, the role of academia here becomes quite important, of being able to see all of these pieces and weave them into a narrative and present to a broader public. You talked quite a bit, and Franz, from the very beginning of UNEP has achieved this, and it has been so successful in these other areas. And you as negotiators have achieved quite a bit, but I'd like to push back a little bit for a more critical assessment. What has UNEP not quite achieved yet? Where could it go next? And what have you as negotiators, what are your frustrations? What you've been able to accomplish as a negotiator, as an individual in this bigger system? And then we'll talk a little bit about multilateralism, which is another issue that you raised. Rebecca, can you jump in on this?
Yeah, one? Sorry. I'm thinking about that question. So what has UNEP not accomplished, and what was I frustrated by? So I think, I don't know where it is now, right? Because my last UNEP meeting was, I think, in 2014. So it has been a while now. And, there's been hopefully a lot of growth, right? There have been many changes. The last time that I went to a UNEP meeting, Achim Steiner was still the executive director. So in my mind still, though, UNEP has gone through a lot of different reform efforts, both internally and externally, right? We as governments have talked for years and a decade about how to change UNEP. We made a lot of changes at Rio Plus 20 in paragraph 88. I think in the good news, we tried to be very thoughtful about that. We tried to do good things. We tried to be more inclusive, right? We tried, more voices at the table means more thoughtful outcomes, harder, but more thoughtful, right? And so all of those things were good. But I maintain UNEP itself is going to remain challenged until and unless governments prioritize it and engagement through it, right? So I'm sorry, it still comes back to member states for me. At the time, one of my big frustrations when I was working on the delegation was all the earmarks, all the budgetary earmarks, right? My hat was the, US engagement with the UN hat. And from a sort of managerial perspective, the worst thing you can ever do to an institution is to earmark its funding, right? And so it was simultaneously ensuring that our priorities were achieved, which is really important. Otherwise, the US is not going to support an institution. But on the other hand, it was undermining our sort of shared priorities as member states within the UN system, right? It's earmarking, it's kind of multilateral 101 is the worst thing you can do to an institution. And so one of my big frustrations at the time was earmarking for special projects. And that demonstrated, again, you made this point, Maria, in your book, that demonstrated sort of lack of trust and then reinforced it, right? It was this perpetual cycle. And so that was a big frustration. Another big frustration for me, Franz, I don't know if you'll laugh or be angry about this, but the IEG conversation, I love institutional architecture. I like to talk about institutions and how they work and processes. I'm a big process person. But I often thought that the IEG conversation was a sort of a sidetrack, like it was getting us away from the priorities. And maybe we were having it sometimes because we couldn't agree on the other priorities. So I sometimes found that frustrating because it was the same argument. We have to have a World Environment Organization. Well, why? And thank you, Maria, for finally showing that we don't have to have the World Environment Organization. But I often felt frustrated in those conversations.
You mean a World Environment Organization? What people say, upgrade UNEP?
Upgrade, right. Yeah, I agree. what John Matuszak used to say, that you could drive a truck through UNEP's mandate, right?
That's right.
He was on my delegation, for those of you who don't know. And it's true. So I think we had the tools, we just were unwilling to use them. And so that was a big frustration. So I thought we were sort of sidetracked by these other conversations. As much as I enjoyed some of them, because I'm a UN nerd and I love thinking about how institutions work together and how they work and how their processes fit. And so I think, again, those conversations did lead to some better outcomes institutionally for some components, but they were frustrating. So I guess that's a sort of roundabout way to answer that question, and I'll leave it there.
All right, I'm also realizing that we're coming up on the hour in about 4 or 5 minutes. But so, Franz, your thoughts.
So, first of all, when you ask, well, on what did UNEP not deliver, then I would say on its core mandate. Having said everything, how positive and enthusiastic I am about UNEP, if the idea of UNEP was to save our planet, we did not succeed. Is it the mistake of UNEP? I agree with Rebecca. It's not the mistake of UNEP. It's a mistake finally of the states. But as positive, I'm someone who really sees the progress, all the achievements of UNEP, but at the same time, we have also to be aware that the degradation is not decreasing, it's still increasing. So from that perspective, UNEP did not succeed. But that's not necessarily a mistake where we can simply blame UNEP for. I think that's, as Rebecca absolutely rightly said, we have to blame ourselves for that. I very fully agree with I think this discussion about the World Environment Organization. We were never supportive of the Environment Organization, World Environment Organization, because we didn't perceive that as an upgrading, but as a side grading. Because, or as John Matheson would say, yes, you drive a truck through the mandate of UNEP. We were not sure that we have strengthened UNEP, but although we were not supportive of that idea, we have to accept if that push was not there, perhaps we would not have gotten a universal membership. So even if we were not sharing that objective, I think we got something where we think was really useful, universal membership for the UNEP Governing Council. So the governance discussion certainly was, I never perceived that as a sidetracking, but as something that is really important to further advance UNEP, but it should certainly not be distracting from the core work of UNEP on the substance as well. I never perceived that as something to try to strengthen machinery to do even more on the substance. So my frustration to UNEP was sometimes that the discussions on substance, especially on substance, was, can you say it over-politicized, or that's perhaps the wrong word, that an artificial divide in that discussion is created. Very often when we look at the problem, at once someone emerges and say, well, this is a north-south problem. To be honest, I don't see many north-south problems in the field of environment. I do not see the conflict line in the negotiations between north-south. It's always the progressive countries, the more ambitious ones who want to have more environmental protection, and there are countries from the north and countries from the south part of that group, and countries who want less or are afraid of more environmental regulation. Whatever, I don't want to make a value judgment, but the difference is not one between developed and developing countries. The difference, there's a different line of difference. And my frustration often is if some purposely try to create that artificial difference because that helps them to walk away from the real problem. Because if you don't, that creates at once a different connotation. Because at once the good guys, the poor guys, and you don't understand anymore or don't look anymore at the real problem as it is. And this artificial north-south divide, I think that is something that is really not helpful.
Thank you very much for this, Franz, because this is exactly what we're going to delve into with our next session, with our next dialogue on May 11th, and we will focus on small countries. We will have the governments of Rwanda and Fiji on the line, and Peru and Colombia, former negotiators of climate, and see what we could learn from climate for plastics, because Rwanda and Peru were the two small states that actually led the new resolution on plastics, a new international global binding environmental agreement that we just negotiated in Nairobi in March. And I was honored to actually serve on the delegation of Rwanda. And we will have the head of delegation, Juliet Kabera, join us on May 11th, that you see here on the screen right now. But I just want to finish with one asking you, today was a very dynamic, very intense dialogue, but Musa Wawuyu noted the Stockholm Plus 50 is coming up. And so let's finish up with your thoughts on what can be, what should be done for UNEP at Stockholm Plus 50. What is your vision of the Stockholm Plus 50 commemoration? What can it do for UNEP? But also, what is your vision for UNEP at 150 years from now? And we will end on a positive note of this amazing discussion with these two negotiators.
Do you want me to, Franz, do you want me to
Rebecca.
jump in, or do you want to go? Okay. So I mean, for Stockholm Plus 50, I still want to see UNEP fulfill that mandate that you can drive a truck through, right? John, it was extremely important to UNEP. He had a huge role there. And I think, you know, he demonstrates how many people care about and are dedicated to this organization and these concepts, right? And so I think for UNEP to fulfill this initial vision, this initial mandate, we need member state support, member state belief, member state resources, member state cooperation, right? And so that's what I would like to see coming out of Stockholm Plus 50, maybe some greater understanding of our common environment and how we have to work together. Real understanding that prioritizes this work. And, you know, in the good news, the forum already exists. We have it. It's UNEP. We have the relationships, we have the venue, we have the processes, we have some ground level of trust, we have the expertise, we have the physical space. Let's use it. Let's use it and make a difference, because we've been maintaining it for this long. Let's empower and use it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Franz.
Thanks, that was very nice. Well, I will talk about 50 together with John Mattusek, referring to. We were organizing already several discussions, informal discussions about the potential of that UNEP at 50. About 5 years ago, I think we had the first informal meeting like that. And from that perspective, I think the way I was organized it, let's be very honest, it's a missed opportunity. We were, all of us, including John, we saw a huge potential for a UNEP plus 50, and the mandate as it was now adopted, that is not allowing us to fulfill this potential. But having said this, at the same time, I think there's still something very positive about it, and that is, it is again an important opportunity to focus again in an ambitious and positive manner on the environmental challenges. To underline that as Kofi Annan was putting it, if the deterioration of the environment continues as it is now, then we will not achieve poverty eradication and economic development. So this is the weakest pillar of sustainable development, and just by having a space focusing on that, that can be a stimulation and a trigger for more political action and will. Because as Rebecca was underlining several times, at the end, it's the countries, it's the UNEP parties who do need to have that will, and not to have that will, and need to see the benefit of action. To your question, well, what would be my wish for UNEP at 100? I would say the best thing is if at UNEP at 100, UNEP could get into retirement because all the problems are solved.
Yes.
Oh, that's a beautiful vision. Retirement because the problems are solved.
I think we could all agree to that.
Exactly. This is a great vision. And with this, I would like to thank everyone who was part of this discussion. Everyone who put in a question, apologies that we couldn't get to all of your questions. But also I want to congratulate Monica Nasibeni for winning a copy of this book by engaging on Twitter. with this discussion. So thank you very much, everyone, for this dynamic engagement. Thank you, Rebecca and Franz. I would like to take a minute and ask someone from our team to actually take a picture of this, because this is a reunion for Rebecca and Franz. So someone take a screenshot right now.
I'm here. I can do it for you.
Excellent, Meg. And there we go. That was a smile. And yeah, maybe Rebecca can hold up your copy.
Oh, there we go. You want that?
Yes.
In front of my Rio +20 poster.
And thank you so much for engaging. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And please join us on May 11th for our last installment in this series, where we will talk member states, second edition, with Rwanda, Fiji, Peru, and Colombia. And we will test France's statement. It's not about North-South. It is about small states being progressive. And this indeed is what we're working on at the Center for Governance and Sustainability at UMass Boston, on reimagining environmental multilateralism with a focus on small states. And yes, France, Switzerland is a small state. So you've always been punching above your weight, and we look forward to engaging you as these issues need to be resolved, and as UNEP nears retirement. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to both of you.
Thank you both. And thank you, Maria and Franz, both of you, for your ongoing excellent work. It's so important.
Same to you, Rebecca. Same to Rebecca, yes. It was really nice seeing you again.
You
Bye.
too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.